Our season continues inside the Jedi T6 shuttle carrying Anakin, Natabre, Ahsoka, and Zala. Anakin and Natabre were in the control room. It was semi-awkward. They were returning from Chancellor Ladan, and with their return was the curiosity of what was shared in that moment after the training regimen for Ahsoka and Zala. The two Jedi generals made a stop at another planet in the area, just to make sure that there were multiple routes to System 9Z1. Instead of returning to the Lihan system after Chancellor Ladan, they stopped off at Takodana and Rifter, seeing that they were all clear for the Starforge just in case. These stops were brief and were done with interchangeable pilots. Anakin took the first sleeping shift, which removed any bit of awkwardness between the two of them after Ahsoka's interruption. Natabre and Anakin flipped when they moved from Takodana to Rifter, and then the students took control over the vessel on the way back to the Lihan system. Now, for the first time, Anakin and Natabre were once again alone, in the cockpit of the ship, waiting to arrive at the Starforge. The irony for the two of them is they were sharing the same exact thoughts. They had those moments before. They were two young individuals grappling with the changes of their galaxy, and they were experiencing the growing pains of going through it. The two of them had shared an experience like that before, but never like that before. Anakin and Natabre had shared anger, pain, sadness, frustration, fear, strength, and triumph with each other. They had shared extreme polars of emotions, and in the middle there was the solidarity they had in one another. And the moment at the top of their minds left an uncomfortable aura in the air. They wanted to speak on it, but how? This had been a continuous issue for the two of them throughout their friendship. There were flares of this spark, and never had it gotten so close to bursting. And here they were, back at square one, pondering the question that had eaten away at them for so long. Their bodies remained still, like they did during their many joint meditations, but their minds were not of that same stillness. Natabre looked over first and turned back away, followed by Anakin repeating the same motion. They had so much that they wanted to say. Natabre's mouth slowly opened as she felt the words slip to her tongue, and as she was about to speak, the sound of a sensor pinged the cockpit, and the ship buckled slightly as it dropped out of hyperspace. Natabre looked down, and she closed her mouth, a small frown forming, but she hid it, lifting her hands to the control yoke and piloting towards the Star Forge. They landed in the hangar as clones ran towards the shuttle and plugged a fueling cord into it. The bay doors opened, and the two Padawans were out before Anakin and Natabre could even leave the cockpit. Ahsoka went to Cody, who was waiting for them, and asked if she could hitch a ride back to Admiral Coburn's flagship. He nodded as Ahsoka waved a very quiet Zala forward. Ahsoka asked if she was alright, and she nodded her head with a soft smile, before following her friend into an LA-AT, where one of their favorite clones, Lucky, was waiting. He greeted them with friendliness as the doors to the LA-AT closed and shot off towards the flagship, or in other words, their home. Natabre and Anakin were still in the cockpit of the ship, sitting in silence, still as statues. Their breathing was their only movement. Anakin turned to Natabre. Maybe this time they could finish what they were trying to say, or maybe do. He asked her if she was okay, and she nodded her head before turning over to face him fully. She told Anakin that she was sorry. She didn't mean to let that moment create tension between the two of them. He laughed and told her that she didn't need to apologize. They turned their full bodies towards each other, and Anakin asked if they could spare a moment to speak about that little experience. She smiled and expressed her desire to do the same thing. Anakin searched for the words to say, and Natabre did too, and right before they could really try to comprehend their own feelings on the matter, the door held a knock, and their eyes looked over. Both of them pursed their lips in frustration. They mimicked each other as if they were on cue, and Commander Cody opened the door, asking if everything was alright. They nodded their heads, and he told the two of them that General Windu was waiting for them in the command room. Cody personally expressed that they should go quickly. The Jedi Master was preparing to deploy his fleet. There had been some developments in their absence. Anakin and Natabre shot up, looking to each other as they followed Commander Cody. They shared looks that could say a million words. While they were walking up to the command deck, The outside of their hands kept tapping each other. Not intentionally, they were just walking too close. They didn't want that short burst of emotion to dissipate. It was so sweet and perfect and calm, and then it was gone. They eventually arrived inside the command center at the top of the forge, and when they entered, they saw General Windu standing with his arms around his back, his eyes scanning the fleet he was about to lead into combat. He looked back and greeted the two young Jedi. They seemed tired, but sleeping inside a T6 had never been the most luxurious thing in the galaxy. The Jedi were going to update the T6 standards, but the Clone War started, and of course after that, the Sith Clone War did. Mace asked them for their report, and Skywalker looked to Natabre, who smiled and stepped forward, listing off the several planets that they had been to, explaining that there was a clear trajectory to System 9Z1, without interference from either faction. Mace thanked them and then asked if they had a moment. They nodded, and he explained to them that there were disturbances now. The war was kicking back into overdrive. The Republic High Command was in a state of panic. Skywalker quickly asked what happened, and Mace explained everything, telling them that Captain Wylnot of Admiral Yularen's fleet had been killed in a massive battle over Pax. He stepped forward, turning on a datapad on the table and reading off the following battles. A Republic loss outside of Mandalore in the Crownus system, not to mention reported activity on the edge of Separatist territory in the Lannic system. Mace slowed down, and slowly exclaimed that there was a loss signal from the long-range scanner present at Zeheth, not far from Admiral Yularen's position. Mace told them that Republic High Command was sending off reinforcements to hold their lines. These attacks weren't all Sith-related. According to Yularen, there was a battle with the Sith at Pax, but the aftermath wasn't known. Mace told them that if the Sith had the forces to continue winning battles like this, then their war effort was over. Anakin and Natabre asked what they could do to help, and he told them that there was nothing. Yularen was dispatching his fleet to destroy the long-range scanner at Zeheth, but it was likely too late. Whoever had captured the base knew the location of every major fleet along their battle line. If the Sith didn't have everything, then they had most of everything. He sighed and leaned over the table, his hands creasing on the desk. He looked to each of them and told them that High Command was going to destroy another star so they could lob out more creations and hopefully win this war. If they didn't do that, then they were probably done for. The Sith had taken initiative over the non-agreed ceasefire, and it was time for the Republic to react. Anakin asked if the Sith knew about their Star Destroyers, and he shook his head. He wasn't sure, but they didn't have any reason to believe the Sith knew. The Separatists had been upping their fleet movements, and he believed that they were preparing for some sort of counterattack. Mace explained that for the time being, they'd be escorting the Forge to System 9Z1. Once that was finished, they'd have the opportunity to move out and assist the Republic on the front lines. Natabre asked about Coburn, and Windu explained that he would be with them in the lead Venator, but his fleet would be established out on the far eastern fleet, far past Yularen Station. Master Windu explained that they'd be joining up with them once the Forge started to harvest the sun at System 9Z1. He looked shamefully with those words, but they couldn't bring it up. It wasn't right. They understood why Mace was feeling the way he was. Killing a son wasn't the Jedi way, and it was painful for the heart. Billions of potential life forms would be killed in mere hours. Mace thanked them for staying with the Forge. He wished that the Force be with them and their Padawans on this leg of the journey. Mace stopped before exiting. He turned and told them that Master Fisto was still inside the structure, but they likely wouldn't see or hear from him. He had entered a deep meditation. He was reeling from the Council's decision to abide by Republic High Command. It wasn't an easy decision, and Mace understood, comparing Master Fisto's commitment to his meditation as a form of isolation or even a brash vow. If they did get a chance to speak with him, he asked that they be delicate. This had been a very difficult journey for him, especially ever since the Leon system went dark. They bowed their heads, wishing that the Force be with Mace Windu on his journey. Instead of returning to where they were inside the cockpit, they again had to put their emotions to the side for the war effort. This continued to challenge their hearts. They both felt it. Anakin and Natabre spread out across the command center inside the Forge. Their hearts felt the same, and their minds ran through those same thoughts. Anakin especially wanted to put the war on hold. He believed that it was right now that he had to come to terms with his past. He had felt his peace come and go, and he wanted it to come back. He wanted to have love again. It was so close, continuing to slip through his fingers. Natabre felt similarly, and while she hadn't felt the same type of love that Anakin felt with Padme before the fall of civilization, she felt the pull, the fluttering inside her heart. the feeling that there was something more than just their code and this war. She too wanted to put the war on hold for her own emotions, but they couldn't. She couldn't either. The Tabre grabbed the holographic board and rolled over it, scanning it and calling Anakin's name as he moved from the edge of the window over to her. He was starting to get physically sick, looking down at the planet dying more every second. He held his stomach, and a guttural discomfort rose from within him before he turned his attention to the board. Mace, Coburn, Cody, and Kit had all filled this out before Fisto went to his meditation. The four had drawn up attacks of the Sith and Separatists, trying to come up with an answer and a counter. There were battle lines drawn, locations of every Republic fleet, especially those with Star Destroyers, and of course lines where there was neutral territory that was either untouched by the conflict or defending itself. Mandalore started a chain. There were other systems, but they didn't face harsh combat from a faction. For example, the Republic had a circumstance where they found a planet and tried to set up camp, but the locals denied them access. The Jedi General in charge of the operation left them alone as they requested. Anakin and Natabre pointed to the map at different points and tried to figure out a good place to counter the Sith. They knew that they were dealing with something new, but what? Their consensus was a new Sith Lord, or at least a new Emperor of sorts, one that was able to rally the Sith in the month since Exar's failure. Natabre asked if it could be the ghost they ran into on Thifera, and Anakin shook his head. The ghost couldn't be everywhere at once. If he was, then they were in danger. This was something more, a calculated foe who was taking power over the gap left behind by Exar. In that absence, they were choosing to use their forces wisely. Natabre pointed up at the map, looking at Velmor. It wasn't far from Mandalore, and there was a much larger fleet present. Due to how far on the eastern flank it was, they weren't equipped with Star Destroyers, only Venators. This was partially due to distance, but also due to the fact that the Republic was trying to keep their new weapons secretive. Velmor was outside of Crownest of Mandalore. She asked Anakin who was there, and he scanned the datapad and told her that Master Agan Kolar's fleet was stationed there. Natabre looked back up at the map, assuming that the Sith were responsible for every victory: Pax, Zeheth, Lannik, and Crownest. If that was the case, then it was wise to assume that the Sith would make a play for a much more important target. Anakin looked up at her, and he knew that she had a point. He ran over to the communication table, which contacted the people inside the control deck. They asked General Skywalker what they could help him with. He told them about his request to contact Master Kolar. They abided, informing him that they would do it, but they might experience some trouble. They were starting up the reactor in the forge and preparing to move it to their next target location. Anakin and Natabre turned back towards the battle map and stood close to each other. They had always found their solidarity with one another. Their shoulders leaned against each other and they felt peace. At the exact same time they were looking at Velmor, Master Agan Kolar was standing on his bridge. He looked over to the command officer, who told them that they were receiving a transmission from the Leon system. He demanded that they take it. The transmission was very fuzzy, but what little came through was a warning, telling them that they were anticipating an attack or something along those lines. When the deck officers tried to get an answer as to why, they squeezed through a little bit more information. But what they could hear was that they didn't have any proper evidence for this. Master Kolar appreciated the warning. He trusted the instincts of the Jedi present at the forge. He told his commanding officer to begin preparing the fleet for an imminent attack. Unlike their presence elsewhere in the galaxy, there weren't any ground or space weapons like a hypervelocity cannon or an ion cannon here, so they were in this alone. Agan's stationing here was a long-term defense for Mandalore. With Republic fleets moving around the new Allied territory, High Command thought it'd be best to set up a secretive fleet in a nearby system. The thing with Velmor was that they weren't extremely close to Mandalore, so their positioning worked as both an extra defense fleet for whoever was present on Mandalore and a middle ground location for troop movements to further eastern systems. The Republic wanted to capture more territory, and with the ever-expanding Republic military, they needed to secure important sectors. It wasn't on a hyperspace lane, but that was kind of the point. Velmor allowed for important trade, control, scouting, and reinforcements that were necessary for victory in the east. Master Kolar returned to his normal positions for the coming hours. Everything was going normally. Then they received an alert on their scanners. A fleet was moving into their system. Agan looked to his commanding officer, who nodded, and they looked back to the front of the viewport to see a fleet drop out of hyperspace. Ah, good. the trade fleet had arrived. These ships were transporting goods from northeastern systems to planets that had been devastated by the war. The fleet of vessels moved past the Republic and departed into hyperspace again. The trade was secured. Master Kohler smiled and moved back towards his quarters. Somewhere between the Leon system and 9Z1, the Starforge rattled back and forth. Anakin and Natabre were sitting in on a meeting between the Jedi Council. It was very hard to hear because the signal was unstable in hyperspace, but they were picking up as much as they could, being that the transmission was coming from this side of the galaxy. The Jedi were discussing the potential destruction of a forbidden temple on Malachor. The Sith had a weapon there, or something. Jocasta had been scanning through old documents and found that there was a temple on that planet with impossible powers. This wasn't a top priority for the Jedi Order, but it was something that they wanted to accomplish. Master Plo Koon, who was in the area, volunteered himself and his men for this mission. He expressed that they could go there and destroy it with an orbital bombardment, but chances are the Sith were more aware of the weapon than they were. The Jedi agreed. They were thankful for Jocasta's warning to them about such a weapon. The conversation moved towards the forge itself. Master Rencesis called upon Anakin and Natabre, who turned their microphones on and reported on everything going on. The forge was handling its first trip through hyperspace very well since being reconstructed. Everything was working perfectly. There were just some unsettling rattles, nothing too large to be worried about. The joke about rattles got a couple chuckles from the Jedi on the call before they moved towards their last piece of discussion. This was saved for last because it was on the more hopeful side of the conversation. Talking about war and death and strategy could be a challenge for any Jedi, especially the younger ones listening to the call. No one younger than 18 was on the call, so they were speaking with very serious tones, making Natabre and Anakin the youngest listeners. But with every topic covered, Master Balaba asked for the status of the younglings and Padawans on Ahch-To. One of the instructors smiled. No one could see the smile, but they told the group of Jedi that the younglings had done well. There were less fights, there were more learning, and there was a sense of hope restored to the youth of the Jedi Order. The younglings and Padawans were now taking up different exercises to train them. There were boating games, lessons in the mountains, running through the sand exercises, and so forth. The conditions were a little harder on them, but this generation of younglings would be stronger than any seen in their history. That brought a smile to the faces of the Jedi listening, but it was also further proof that they needed to win this war before these children reached adulthood. The call ended with optimism, and the two Jedi inside the forge leaned against each other. They spoke about the call and their future assignment to the far side of the galaxy. Thanks to their time scanning the galactic battle map, they had a couple ideas of where they could take their fleet once they established themselves. Kerburn, inside of his Venator, was babysitting Ahsoka and Zala. This wasn't intentional, they just happened to be a part of his ship when they jumped into hyperspace. Back inside the forge, Natabre pointed at the map from her seat and told Anakin that a location of Toydaria would be good for them. Anakin agreed, even suggesting that Bodajef or Halmad could be good as well. She shrugged a little bit. They didn't want to push too far north. That was Dathomir territory up there. Who knew where the witches aligned themselves, or if they were even still there? Anakin agreed. Probably too far north to take their fleet, especially with Master Kolar so far below that. But then he said maybe they could though. It was close to Mandalore. Natabre nodded her head, saying that they would need permission from the Council to go so close to Mandalore. That alone would be something that would be highly debated about between the High Command and Jedi High Council. Back over Valmor, Agan Kolar was thrown from his bed. The ship was rattling and he stumbled out of his room. He looked down the corridors to see clones running and red lights flickering on and off repeatedly, with a deafening alarm sounding. They were under attack. The Jedi Master ran through the starship, his body slamming into walls before eventually reaching the bridge. When he looked out, he saw a Sith fleet, one with a flagship bearing down on them. A large red strip covered the middle of the ship and ran all the way up the body towards the bridge before stopping. The command officer called out orders, ones that rang out into the hangar bay. Clones jumped into their starfighters and lifted off, blasting in the battle. The rest of the fleet, thanks to the warning from the Starforge, was able to get into position to counter this attack. Agan looked to the fleet. The light cruisers were holding their own, and the Venators were making a strong counter-assault. His eyes went from the fleet he commanded to the other fleet, as he pondered who was in charge of the Sith force. No one had seen those markings before. There was a reason for no one having seen these markings. Darth Mar stood on his bridge with his arms crossed. His robe sat idly on the floor behind him, as they whisked in the wind when his men on the deck ran past him. The long-range cannons on his capital ships unloaded their firepower into the Republic fleet. He turned and looked down towards the deckhands, and they, upon his gaze, called up to him, informing him that they were making their mark. But the Republic was ready for this attack. Not that Republic fleets typically had the defenses down, but this scenario was different. The Jedi here were prepared for them. Mar stood confused, wondering how that was possible. He had spoken to the immortal Emperor. They were in good relations long before Exar ever took command. Valkorin and Mar had discussed strategy for the eastern quadrant of the galaxy. Initially, Mar was going to lead the assault on Mandalore, but that was given over to Darth Zana. Instead, Mar informed Valkorin that he would hide along hyperspace lanes and potential Republic-aligned planets before making any strikes. Darth Mar had the patience to wait this out, more patience than most Sith had. So when the time came for him to use his skills, he was ready. Mar had been outside of Valmore for about 2.5 weeks by this point. He had been watching over the trade route, waiting for his moment to strike. The irony is, he wasn't even capturing the route. He just wanted to allow the Republic to know that the Sith knew about this trade route. In his mind, it was a great way to instill panic into their ranks. If he could effectively make a strike on this trade route, the Republic would instinctively go the long way around it, so Mar wouldn't have to be here and could continue to wreak havoc across battlefronts in the Eastern Quadrant, while the Republic would continue to avoid Valmore due to a loss. First thing was first though, he needed to defeat this Jedi fleet. His hands moved out and signaled to his command deck his attack formation. They followed it closely. The fighters never got into the fray. Instead, the point defense systems activated as the Republic defense fleet pushed for an insane offensive. Darth Maul was surprised by this. Typically, the Jedi wouldn't be so aggressive, but that's what they were doing. They were trying to destroy the Sith and push them from this territory. Master Kolar understood how important keeping Valmore was for the Republic, due to the fact that it constantly gave relief to planets and systems in need. The fighters that approached the Sith fleet were detonated by their light cannons. There were some corvettes in the fleet, but the Sith capital ships used their light surface cannons to rip through these Republic fighters, whereas their long-range turbo lasers continued to fire at the flagships. The attack was a light shields heavy firepower type of operation. In close range, this would be suicide, but from afar, it wasn't exactly the biggest deal. Agan and his commanding officer knew that this wasn't going to work for them. Their fighters needed support, and with them already losing a fourth of their fighter fleet, they needed to make sure they won this. The Republic abandoned position in what seemed to be a panic move. Agan at this point started to wish that he had taken full command from the Coruscant Military Academy officer. This guy was a first-timer, someone who never saw real action. At least with Tarkin, despite his tone, there was an officer with experience. This man here prepared for combat with foes that would play an even match, and the Sith were not those foes. Agan tried to course correct the fleet movement, but it only made things worse. The fleet was already so far out of position and the Sith preyed off it. The only reason it was there was because Agan was sleeping when they attacked. Darth Maul had been studying the system the entire time they were outside of it. The Sith fleet had been established in no man's land. They weren't near a planet or even within the system. They sat just outside of it. They set up some sensor nodes and tracked what the Republic was transporting. That's how they knew it was a trade route. So while Valmore was used by the Republic for trade and a chance to reinforce Mandalore, the Sith had been using it to see what the Republic was actually up to, and it seemed like they were simply playing the game of caring for the weakest link, something the Sith believed would cost the Republic the war. This was mostly a Jedi-run operation as it was, so this loss would divide them. Darth Maul knew that this victory would be imperative for the eventual capture of Mandalore. Crownist was gone. It would only be a matter of time until Mandalore fell too. Maul lifted his third finger and thumb. A deck officer tapped a couple buttons on her command device, and a signal deployed inside the hangar of every ship in the fleet. The Sith fighters deployed and ravaged through the unsuspecting Republic forces. Darth Maul waited for the perfect moment. Next to him, there was a little stand. On it was a datapad, and he kept one eye on the datapad and the other eye on the battle taking place around him. He waited until this moment to deploy his fighter fleet. The Republic fighters were engaged with the battleships, and at this point, were too distracted to do anything about a counterattack. Republic fighters were trying to bombard the flagships, but the point defense systems were keeping them safe. Without a counter to that, The fighters were just unloading everything they had and not doing any damage, while also trying to avoid the surface cannons. When the Sith fighters deployed, a Republic fighter fleet that had already been damaged was caught off guard. They tried to fend for themselves, but it proved to no avail. The Sith fleet, on the other hand, pressed forward, maximizing their firepower as a bomber vessel pulled forward. Mar had himself an experimental battleship, one he called a bomber cruiser. It was essentially a traditional bomber fighter in large ship form. It had strong shields but a very limited range. Mar watched the ship close in on the front lines of the battlefield. The rest of the fleet laid down supportive fire. Master Kolar saw the ship coming and told the officer to turn the fleet around. Valmor had been lost, but they could still keep this fight alive. The officer looked at the Jedi General blankly. Agan knew this battle was over from the first move the officer made. He had been trying to rectify those mistakes, but it was too late now. Kolar moved forward and called out his orders to the fleet, telling them to retreat to the flagship and prepare for the jump to hyperspace. The Republic started its fighting retreat, with acclimated troop transports getting blown out of the battle, their explosions sending shockwaves into the smaller ships of the fleet. Darth Mar reached out his hand and clenched his fist. He wished he could fight the Jedi Master on board of the lead flagship, but it was too well defended. As Agan's Venator got turned all the way to the side, the bomber cruiser got in range of the first Venator, not Agan's, and unloaded all of its missiles and torpedoes as they slammed into the side of the capital ship. Explosions rang out across the vessel as another corvette detonated next to it. The bomber continued to unload heavy ordnance into the ship until it exploded in a fiery array. The fighters called back to the flagship and told the Jedi to go without them, and Agan told them that he would not leave them. The clone ace pilot told them to go. This fight was lost as he cut the transmission. The rest of the clone pilots understood what their ace was doing with them. They were going to fight this battle till the bitter end. As they pulled back around, they could see from the side of the viewports another Venator exploding. The ace cried out over his fighter comms, "For the Republic," as they all dove in. It was a mix of the final fighters in this battle. What was left of the Republic fleet limped away into hyperspace, hopefully finding refuge somewhere in the galaxy. The clone fighter squad pushed forward against one of the multiple flagships in the fleet. Darth Maul walked over to the port side of his bridge and tied his arms around his back, interlocking one wrist into his hand as he watched. The Republic fighters were getting blown out of the sky. Their survival rate was dropping. They would all be dead soon. Such a shame too. They were set up for failure. In any other circumstance, they may have actually proved to be useful adversaries to the Sith. Mar watched a bomber detonate, sending an explosion into a starfighter. They opened fire, riddling the hull of a flagship with many explosions. Nothing too deep, but it turns out the Republic fleet had done damage to one of Mar's destroyers. The ace clone pilot spun his ship, outflying his men. He wasn't trying to, but he was just the better pilot. His blasters pierced the viewport of the bridge, and when he could feel a sense of triumph, the booster on his starfighter popped, and he was sent barreling towards the bridge in a scream of terror. By the time he collided with it, all of his men were dead. His death would at least come with the destruction of a Sith destroyer, though most of the troops inside would escape before its actual destruction. Darth Mar turned back and told the deckhand to inform the Supreme Leader that they'd accomplished what they came here for. As he walked past them, he told them to remove their fleet from Valmor. They were finished for now. Inside the Starforge, departing from yet another system, was Anakin and Natabre. They were sleeping in the barracks. On one cot was Anakin, and on the other one next to him was Natabre. They had fallen asleep during one of their conversations. The forge itself had to jump from system to system, just because of its sheer size, plus it was safer, considering this technology was still fairly new for the Republic to operate. Anakin was in the middle of another dream. Perhaps the worst thing about these missions was the fact that he had to face the terrible nightmares more frequently. There was something about the peace that encouraged these nightmares to continue to happen. Anakin was seated inside the T6 in this dream. Zala walked in and asked him for help, so he got up and followed her out. She pointed forward and he could see the silhouette of someone so close yet so far away. He stepped closer as Zala grabbed his hand. Her grip was rough and gritty. Her skin was cold to the touch, like she had lost her life. He looked over and her eyes were closed, and a tear slipped from them. He called her name, but she sobbed softly, telling Anakin she was afraid. Before he could ask what she was afraid of, he heard his name. The voice was so familiar. He turned over and Zala's grip on his hand left. He could feel nail indents on his hand. He lifted it up, and saw small marks that continued to grow, a scar of sorts forming, and his veins turned dark purple, as if he had been cursed. He felt chills roll down his spine, and then Anakin's focus went from his hand to the person turning around to face him. It was Padme. Her face was burned. She was missing patches of skin. Her senator robes were torn and her body was discombobulated. She fell over, asking him why he did this to her. He didn't understand. He started to get closer, but as he took his first step, he felt it crawling from underneath his skin. His eyes watered and he looked to his wrist where Zala had gripped him. What he saw petrified him. He could see a hand grasping his wrist from underneath his skin. He tried to pull at it, but he couldn't. His eyes went back to Padme, who groaned in pain, tears slipping from her eyes as she begged to know why he did this. Obi-Wan's voice rang out and told him that he was a failure. He betrayed Padme. Anakin asked if it was because of Before he could finish saying her name, a screech cried out, one that sent Anakin jolting from his sleep. He looked over to Natabre, who got up to comfort him. She got to his side and gently rubbed his back, asking him if it was another nightmare, and he nodded his head. His breath was shaky. She told him it would be okay, expressing that she would go and get him some water. As Natabre got up, she turned around and looked at him in the eyes, lowering himself to face him. She outstretched her hands and cupped his face, smiling softly. He closed his eyes and felt the warmth surround him, until, just like with Zala, those hands became cold. They slipped underneath his skin. There was a pulling, and when his eyes opened, it was gone. He felt weight in his hands and looked down. Natabre was looking up to him, telling him that she didn't want to leave. She didn't want to go. He then again jolted from his sleep and ran. Natabre looked over and saw Anakin slam into another cot and fall over. His skin was trembling, he was in a cold sweat, and he could see a dark shadow following him again. Anakin searched for his lightsaber, but he couldn't find it. He fell into another cot, praying that this dream would come to an end. He cried out, telling the shadow to leave him alone. What Anakin saw wasn't really there. His eyes flickered. He was in the forge, then he was somewhere he had never been before. There was mist and ancient chanting. It wasn't a chant from an individual, it sounded like a coven. He flickered back, and there was a shadow of Natabre, then something else, then Natabre again, getting closer by the second. Before he knew it, he was in the cave again, surrounded by teal and greenish waters that illuminated, before being in the barracks again. Anakin fell back and the door opened behind him, and he saw Natabre's face catch the light of the hallway, and tears streamed from his face. He didn't want this anymore. She approached him slowly and asked what happened, asking if he was okay. He nodded his head, seeing that it was really her, that she was really there. He asked her for the time, and she gave it. Okay, he wasn't dreaming anymore. She knew to answer that question as quickly as she did by this point. Natabre bent down and inched closer, reaching out her hand and telling him that it was okay now. She had his back, she had him. He slipped his hand into hers. It was soft to the touch, gentle and peaceful. She moved in next to him and asked if he wanted to tell her about the dream. He shook his head, so she told him that it was okay, that he didn't need to. She slid her arm around his back and gently held his other hand, reminding him that it was just a dream. None of this would become reality, she promised. His head slid down onto her shoulder. Her thumb pressed delicately against his hand and swayed back and forth. She reminded him that in all the chaos in the galaxy, they'd always have each other's backs. Nothing would ever change that, she promised. That, my friends, is episode 5 of the Sith Clone Wars Season 3. Hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.